What's going on, Summoners? Welcome back to another Wild Rift video. I'm Kangas, and today I'm going over the 10 best champions for all you advanced players out there. This list of champs will encompass 2 champs per lane, each that have very high skill caps. These champions are difficult to play though, and may be a little overwhelming to get into for beginners. So if you want to try them out, make sure to practice these champions and really study their mechanics before bringing them into ranked games. Anyways, smack that like button like I smack Nate whenever we 1v1. And let's get into this.
Before we begin, here's our question of the day. Who do you guys find the most mechanically difficult champion to play in Wild Rift? For me, I know I talk about this guy a lot in our videos, but it's gotta be Yasuo. I always have trouble keeping track of which minions I've dashed through and which ones I haven't yet, and sometimes that comes back to bite me. But let me know yours in the comments below. We'll start off with the Baron lane. The first champion featured today is Akali. Akali is an incredibly fast, mobile assassin that utilizes her dashes and invisibility to sneak up on enemy squishies. She's a very strong champion in the Wild Rift, especially in the right hands. Her kit relies heavily on hitting her third ability, Shuriken Flip. She somersaults backwards while throwing out a shuriken. Hitting the skill shot allows players to dash back in and continue dealing damage. But if you miss the shot, you not only position yourself further away from the enemy, but you lose your best opportunity to close in the gap. Now, if hitting a single skill shot was all it took to play Akali, she wouldn't be on the list. Akali can also create a Shroud of Mist, where she gains movement speed and becomes invisible. Understanding how to outplay opponents using the invisibility differentiates an amateur Akali from an advanced Akali. Using the mist effectively involves getting into the opponent's heads, while stalling enough time to escape and become slippery bait for the enemy team. Akali's job in a teamfight is to assassinate at least one champion while still just confusing the enemy. But the assassination is debatably the easy part. A great Akali player can quickly grab a kill and escape in a matter of a few seconds. A strong understanding of positioning and teamfighting is required for players to succeed with Akali. Without the confidence to run in and kill the enemy backline, Akali players will just be useless. Next up, we have Fiora, the Grand Duelist. Fiora excels in 1v1 scenarios and can dominate the flow of a game. She has sustain, crowd control, and even mobility all built into her kit, making her the perfect champion for advanced players looking to 1v9 games. Fiora's greatest asset is her second ability, Riposte, which allows her to completely ignore any crowd control for about a second. Not only does this skill block it, but it also reflects crowd control back at the enemy, potentially stunning many targets while denying key skills during fights. Utilized properly, this skill can take the entire enemy team off guard, allowing her to dive in and wreak havoc. But since the skill has a rather long cooldown, it's very possible to whiff the ability entirely, leaving Fiora very vulnerable in the upcoming fight, a scenario many beginners will find themselves in. Don't worry, me included. This requires Fiora players to have a very fast reaction speed while also understanding essentially every crowd control skill in the game. To add on to her kit, Fiora's passive reveals vital spots on enemy champions. Hitting it gives her bonus damage, sustain, and movement speed. Having a firm understanding of positioning is an absolute necessity when playing Fiora, otherwise players will die while trying to chase vitals that are out of their reach. Along with her ability to reset her autos through well-timed skills, Fiora's kit is one of the most satisfying, yet hard to master in the game. Next up, let's take a look at jungle. Evelynn is an incredibly broken champion, but only if you understand how to properly read the map. At level 5, Evelynn's passive grants her Camouflage, which allows Evelynn to be invisible at most times. She loses invisibility when in close range of an enemy champion or when she's attacking. This is a really strong advantage to have as a jungler, as junglers rely heavily on ganking and pressuring lanes. But without the knowledge of how to use this advantage, the Evelynn pick can be potentially useless in the hands of an amateur jungler. Evelynn is really weak in the early game, and lacks a lot of dueling potential against other junglers. Knowing exactly how to scale up without risking death early is paramount. If you run into the enemy jungler early on as Evelynn and pick a fight 1v1, you'll usually lose. And if Evelynn falls behind, it becomes really easy for her enemy to survive her burst damage and just lock her down, making her pretty much useless. An Evelynn player needs to know how to safely scale the early game while feeling out the lane pressures. She excels in catching out targets that are alone, as the invisibility often catches them off guard. Because of this, knowing when your opponent is vulnerable in their current position is essential to maximizing Evelynn's play. Her burst damage and escape from her ultimate give her incredible utility, provided the timing and positioning of her engages are smart. Her mechanics and skills are incredibly unique, which also just makes her difficult to play. But in the hands of an experienced player, she is extremely oppressive, and I think we've all experienced that at least once at this point. As a marksman jungler, Graves relies on skill shots and gap closes to kite the enemy. Unlike many other junglers, he has no solid lockdown. This makes him much harder to play for beginner junglers. Graves ganks require a lot of nuance, often relying on a well-timed follow-up from allies, or just key setups from CC. The key to ganking on Graves is controlling the enemy's pathing using your own positioning. He typically can't just run at the enemy head first, especially in the early game. Graves' biggest weakness is his early game fragility. If he ever falls behind, playing Graves becomes quite a struggle. As a marksman, he can't protect his team, and without items, he doesn't have enough damage to carry his own weight. To play Graves effectively, players need to know how to power farm, while also keeping control of the map. Graves' greatest asset is his mid to late game. He has the ability to burst down squishies and shred tanks. Graves' dash and area of effect attacks make his impact in teamfights very substantial, and his kit has a smoke screen that grants a small area of effect slow and blind, but that's about it in terms of CC. That doesn't sound like much, but an area of effect blind, if utilized properly, can actually disrupt the entire flow of the enemy team. Blinding enemy champions means leaving them vulnerable to skill shots from your own teammates. They can't see the map or anything around them, so they can't react accordingly. Understanding how to optimally use the smoke screen differentiates great players from the average Joes. Next up, we got mid lane. Their Yasuo versus our Yasuo has become a constant meme in the community. As one of the most mechanically demanding champions in the entire game, Yasuo can provide massive benefits for the allied team. His kit has a bajillion dashes, crowd control, a wind wall, and excellent scaling to become a monster in the late stages of the game. But if he can be such an impressive champion, how come so many people complain about players feeding with him? Playing Yasuo requires a firm understanding of positioning. Each dash in his kit pushes him forward, which leaves him vulnerable to ganks. What most players do not realize is that the dash can be used to escape as well, rather than just forcing all-ins constantly. This nuance is lost on many low elo players, as they tunnel in and push haphazardly. Mastering Yasuo requires a constant eye on minion wave management, as they're key to both escaping and engaging. Knowing how to escape messy situations is a must for Yasuo, as he is very vulnerable to crowd control. Players therefore need to be able to switch gears immediately when they see a threat. As with many damage carries, playing Yasuo becomes incredibly difficult from behind due to the lack of defensive options. Playing Yasuo is the ultimate test of patience and skill. Just don't lock him in if you're on my team, please. Zed is another assassin with an incredibly high skill cap. Being able to outsmart and surprise the enemy team with the usage of your shadows is key to mastering the champion. With the usage of his ultimate, this marks a total of 3 shadows at most to keep track of. This means understanding the positional advantages of 3 different places at once. In a matter of a second or two, players must decide which shadow is most beneficial to teleport to. In a 1v1 scenario, especially against an AD carry, it's quite easy to just burst the squishy and get out. But during key team fights, where being locked down is a very real threat, timing switches between shadows requires incredibly fast mechanics and thinking. Because of Zed's ultimate, which amplifies damage, Zed's playstyle exponentially rewards hitting every single skill shot during a very short time frame. Fast reactions and great aim is a must for playing Zed at the highest level. Moving on to AD carries, Draven is probably the hardest AD carry to play in the game right now. Playing him is a literal balance act, juggling his flying axes while keeping an eye on literally everything else that an AD carry needs to think about. The more axes he catches, the more he's rewarded when acquiring a kill. This becomes a very lucrative incentive to catch axes and play aggressively, but the issue is, between catching his axes and watching what's going on in the map, it's really easy to fall into dangerous positions as Draven. With no dash to escape, no invisibility to hide under, a bad Draven player can be easily punished for walking towards an ambitious axe. Mechanically speaking, he has to keep track of where he moves and where he sends his own axes. This is much easier said than done, as this becomes a multitasking minigame in an already mentally tasking video game. But in terms of raw auto attack damage, Draven deals the most out of all AD carries by far. Thanks to his spinning axes, his auto attacks become empowered, dealing almost twice the damage of his normal auto attacks. Under the right hands, Draven can snowball out of control, building leads that result in often 3-shotting the enemy AD carry. But Draven's base mechanics rely heavily on not falling behind. If he dies, he loses half the bonus gold acquired from getting a kill. Talk about risk versus reward. Corki is a caster AD carry that relies heavily on skill shots. His job is to be in the middle of his team, waiting for an opportunity to deal burst damage. His ultimate ability shoots out a long-range rocket that fly in a straight line. Players unable to hit these skill shots in Corki will find themselves severely lacking damage. Corki's third ability also shoots a short-range Gatling gun in front of him. Knowing when to abuse the defense-shredding capabilities of the Gatling gun is incredibly rewarding, but also serves as a risk. Most of his skills have longer range, but the short range of the Gatling gun forces him to get up close and personal. Balancing his kiting range and knowing how to maximize his damage output is incredibly rewarding, but risky, as walking up to Gatling gun enemies in the face leaves him vulnerable to engage and burst damage. Now moving on to support picks. Lulu is the most mechanically intensive support champion in the game by far. Like, there's just so many different options available for that champion. 2 of her skills can be casted on allies, on herself, or on enemies. Each option has different advantages, and being able to weigh each advantage according to the situation is essential to playing her well. Casting on an ally gives them buffs, but leaves Lulu very vulnerable to attacks. Meanwhile, casting on the enemy effectively counters any play that they may have. This makes Lulu players always ask themselves, do I want to help my teammate, help myself, or hinder the enemy? A selfish play is sometimes necessary to stay alive and carry the game, but too selfish of a play can end up resulting in the rest of your team dying. Playing Lulu requires a strong understanding of both how much the player can impact the game on their own and how much they can impact the game through helping others. Knowing when to switch priority requires profound experience and game knowledge. And you know our analysts won't give me a list without this guy on it. Next up, we got Braum. As very much a defensive pick, Braum exists to protect and help allies. For players who are not used to the team games and don't understand the concept of peeling, Braum is just not the champion for them. His entire kit is built off of being nearby an allied champion, making the understanding of teamfight mechanics an absolute must. His mechanics and skills aren't necessarily hard to land or use, but the hardest part about Braum is having unwavering trust in his carries and the ability to play solely for his team. This mindset is really difficult to adopt for newer players, especially those who are not used to the dynamics of the duo lane. In the right hands, mine, Braum can be extremely annoying to deal with. Thanks to his very versatile crowd control and his projector blocking shield, the amount of utility an experienced Braum player can provide in a teamfight is incredible.
Remember, be sure to firmly understand how to use these champions before running ranked games with them. These champions all have nuances and mechanics that, when utilized properly, can take over games. But if you have fingers like bot, then you can easily int on them. Sorry, it had to be said. But anyway, thanks for watching, ProGuides fam. Make sure to answer our question of the day in the comments down below. Sub to the channel. We just hit 100K subs, which is just crazy, and we love you for it, and we can't wait for the future content to come out. But most importantly, good luck on the Rift. Stay hydrated, and I'll see you in the next one.